Oh, I suppose we're live then now. Sorry. Um, Hello, everyone. My name is Olivia Marcus, and I'm here speaking with Dr. Wade Davis. Before I begin, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. I speak to you from the unceded territories of the Ohlone and Muwekma Ohlone peoples, the latter of which are still fighting for federal recognition after their arbitrary erasure almost 100 years ago by the state. I remember their connection to this region and give thanks for the opportunity to live, work, learn, and grow on their traditional homeland. And I also acknowledge that the state dictated erasure of Indigenous identities in the United States was often done in collaboration with anthropologists, a discipline in which I am trained and which affords me a privileged platform to share my thoughts. So with that, I introduce Dr. Wade Davis, and I'll launch into questions. Your intellectual pursuits have encompassed ethnography, ethnobotany, ethnobiology, history, photography, and filmmaking. You've written on topics ranging from Amazonian life worlds and indigenous uses of psychotropic plants to Haitian Vodun, Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime, and even the history of the first successful British expeditions to Mount Everest, for which you won, I think, the highest book award in the United States for nonfiction. As a former student of the foundational ethnobotanist Richard Evans Schultes, you have given the world insight into Schultes and his protege Timothy Plowman's incredible minds and careers in your book, One River. And of course, you've established yourself as a prominent anthropologist and ethnobotanist with a very global focus, having authored 22 books and over 200 articles. And just 10 days ago, you released your most recent book, Magdalena, River of Dreams, which features the complexity of life in Colombia, a place which you've been closely connected to since your teens. And last year you were featured in Alessandro Angelou's documentary, The Path of the Anaconda, which expounds on the vitality of biodiversity and indigenous knowledge in Colombia's Amazonian region. And among your many activities, you currently are a professor of anthropology at the University of British Columbia. And I would like to start there with with a rather broad question related to this role as a professor and educator. So how do you perceive your role as an academic influence in these rapidly proliferating spaces of psychedelic science? And specifically, I want to know, when you deliver a keynote at a conference dedicated to neuropsychiatric and psychopharmacological research, what would you most like your audience to consider and reflect on?
Well, Olivia, thank you very much for that warm introduction. And we are here on unceded territory, the Coast Salish people. You know, that term unceded, people don't really understand and maybe think that we're saying those things in a tokenistic way. In Canada, at least, it's actually rooted in law. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 said that every First Nation Indigenous people had to be fairly and justly treated with. And as the Canadian frontier came west, the demographic collapse was such that in a place like British Columbia, which is a landmass as bigger than California, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho put together, the native population had collapsed to 20,000. And there was a sort of sense in the hubris of the colonial administrators that this collapse was going to continue until the Indigenous people were simply exhausted and eliminated. So they didn't treat. And guess what? The Indigenous voices are still with us to inform us, to inspire us, to work with us in collaboration. And because of that, the Canadian government has no option but to treat with the First Nations, who it's not simply unceded territory. It is land that is, by every definition of British jurisprudence and law, still titularly theirs. And I think it says a lot about Canada, frankly, that we are prepared to do that. And that the polls suggest that the public, though cognizant of how expensive and how complicated politically that may be, the polls suggest that the Canadian people are completely behind that. And just imagine what it would be like in the States if Obama, for example, had announced that he was going to the American Southwest to treat nation to nation with the Navajo to determine who actually owned the lands around the Grand Canyon. I mean, he'd be run out of town on tarred and feathered, as you say. Mm-hmm. And yet in Canada, it's something about this spirit we have of conciliation, of true pluralism, that is really the strength of the country. And incidentally, it's one of the things that allowed us to endure and combat the pandemic in ways that the Americans can only imagine. But back to your question about, I mean, the introduction sort of, I've always thought of myself not as an academic. I mean, for most of my life, I was an independent scholar. I'm a kind of entrepreneur of knowledge, a storyteller. And this wasn't really an accident. When I was going through university, I was extraordinarily fortunate to fall into the orbit of two extraordinary mentors. When I look back, I don't know how you feel, Olivia, about your mentors, but it is such a blessing to come into the orbit of a man or a woman who can truly take a young life that's not even formed yet and give it meaning and purpose. To teach a young person who doesn't think they're anybody, that they in fact are somebody. And my two influences were, of course, the legendary Professor Richard Evans Schultes, the man who sparked the psychedelic era, if you will, with his botanical discovery of the identity of the so-called magic mushrooms in Oaxaca in 1938. But Schultes was a man of action indeed. He, in 18 years of studying with him, I don't think I once had an intellectual discussion. He'd say things to you like, Wade, there's one river I think you should know, knowing full well that the process of getting to that affluent would involve experiences guaranteed to assure you that if you emerge from the forest alive, you would do so a more knowledgeable human being. So merely to walk into his shadow was to kind of aspire to greatness. And in an era when most Americans and Canadians had never heard of the Amazon, he drew to the Botanic Museum in a remarkable cadre of characters, Tim Plowman, Andrew Weil, and a series of sort of acolytes from beyond the university, like the McKenna brothers and many, many others. But my other influence was David Maybury Lewis, the great humanist, the great social anthropologist, the founder of cultural survival. A man, although he was from the British School of Anthropology, was in spirit very much in the Boasian tradition of activism. And one of the things that we forget about anthropology, you mentioned that anthropologists have been partners in oppression. I think that's a little bit glib. Certainly in the experience of British and French anthropology with the settlement and the carving up of Africa, there was a time when anthropologists were sort of, if not servants of the crown, they were at least sent out or did go out to try to make sense of these vast territories with these vast cultures that, for better or for worse, were now under colonial domination. And certainly anthropologists served a dubious role in the early years of the Vietnam War. But I prefer to focus on the liberation that anthropology gave us. Now think about it. Olivia, if you go back to your great-grandfather and mother, and you think of all their certitudes about the role of women in the home, the role of the father in the public sphere, in parliament, in business, attitudes towards homosexuality, hard notions of what a family was and what it was not, attitudes towards the environment, attitudes towards race. All of those certitudes you would not embrace for one moment. And we look back on these movements that took women from the kitchen to the boardroom, people of color from the woodshed to the White House, gay people from the closet to the altar, and we see them as products of social movements, and they certainly were the product of resistance and protest and movements around the world. But the critical thing is the ideas of the 19th century had to be shattered. And they weren't shattered by popular movements. They were shattered by a small cadre of contrarians who rallied around Franz Boas. These are these legendary anthropologists like Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict, who famously said the purpose of anthropology is to make the world safe for human differences. People like Gregory Bateson, Zora Neale Hurston, all of whom were saying things that were absolutely anathema to the established order, that race is a social construct, that manners don't make the men and women make the manners, that the world into which you were born is just one model of reality, that the other peoples of the world aren't failed attempts at being you, that there's no evolutionary development of society, that every culture shares the same genius, which is expressed based on individual histories and individual inclinations and adaptive imperatives. All those ideas were the sociological equivalent of splitting the atom. They shattered the European mind, and all the movements that we celebrate today are the children of anthropology. And in fact, if you, for example, understand that it makes perfect sense for a Jewish girl to be pursuing the breadth of the Buddhist Dharma, if you understand that it's perfectly normal for a Chinese man to be in love with a Swedish girl, if you understand that family is not defined by male and female alone, but any household that surrounds children with love, if you understand what it means when that woman out of the Black Lives Matter movement said, no, that's not the monument to the Confederacy. I, with my mixed blood, with my ancestor raped by an overseer, I am your monument to Confederacy. If you understand what she meant by that, you are a child of anthropology. So I think, anthropology, you're quite correct, has turned its back on activism in a rather flaccid way. Anthropologists now spend most of their time studying anthropology and themselves. But in its inception, people like David Maybury Lewis were absolute activists who believed that anthropologists could serve as a conduit to culture, as advocates to facilitate the voices of Indigenous people being amplified. And those were the influences I came under. And so for me, from the very inception of my career, I recognized that even at a time when biologists weren't speaking to social scientists, as you're too young to remember, but when the Dalai Lama spoke at Harvard on the end of his final tour, that night, E.O. Wilson was introducing Norman Myers across the road, who had written the first book anticipating the biodiversity crisis. And in apologizing to Myers for the sparse audience in that hall, E.O. Wilson, the most beautiful man I've ever met, the greatest biologist of the century, still said, and I quote, if even Harvard students can't get their priorities right and they'd rather be across the way listening to that religious kook, you know how far we have to go to educate the public at large. That wasn't Wilson. That was a sign of how divided the worlds were. Anthropologists couldn't abide the misanthropic elitism of the naturalists, and the naturalists looked at people, Indigenous people in particular, as part of the problem, not the solution. I was the only kid that night running back and forth between the two talks because I realized that the erosion of cultural diversity and biological diversity were one and the same thing. And so,
can I interrupt you there and ask actually a question on that topic? And so I would actually like to talk about this relationship between Western science and Indigenous knowledge, which the story was referring to. Even the way I phrase this question is problematic, as since it infers this dichotomy between science is the domain of Western civilization and Indigenous knowledge is the domain of ancestral wisdom imparted by so-called non-moderns, as we say in anthropology. We know that both scientists and shamans, so to speak, have their fair share of empirical knowledge, logical theories, and of course rely heavily on ancestral wisdom. And you have written on the intersection of these domains. You were just saying have personal experience working in the intersection of these domains, having been trained in biology, anthropology, ethnobotany, and being somewhat of a citizen of the world. So what are the major problems and tensions in reifying this dichotomy between science and indigenous or traditional knowledge?
I'm not sure there should be a divide at all. This is one of the great things about Schultes. He found himself really a man inspired by the 19th century in a way, but profoundly progressive at the same time. And in the 1940s, he found himself living amongst any number of indigenous societies in the Northwest Amazon. And he was the first person they had encountered from the outside who wasn't there to transform their lives, rape their daughters, challenge their religious beliefs. He was just a solitary student of plants who was there to learn from individuals that he viewed not as shaman as much as true natural philosophers who had studied the flora upon which their lives depended with the same perspicacity with which he had studied his pursued his intellectual interests in botany as a scholar. He didn't really distinguish, and I think some of this does bring us back to ayahuasca. One of the remarkable things was that Schultes very early on sense that there was something going on. You know, every up until then, all indigenous discovery had been accounted for by trial and error, which was a kind of a meaningless euphemism that statistically made no sense. So take, for example, ayahuasca. Many in this audience will be very familiar of this kind of curious combination of plants. It's not a preparation, a plant, it's a preparation. And it includes Psychotria viridis, a shrub in the modest shrub in the coffee family, full of tryptamines, 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine, dimethyltryptamine. But the tryptamines famously are not orally active. They're denatured by an enzyme found in the human stomach, monoamine oxidase. They can only be taken orally if taken in conjunction with some other compound that momentarily denatures the MAO. This has now become, you know, part of kind of, you know, folklore in those who are interested in these plants. But it turns out that the woody liana, Banisteriopsis capi, it contains beta-carbolines, of course, harmine and harmaline, which are MAO inhibitors of the precise sort necessary to potentiate the tryptamines. And so they're put together either as an infusion or as a decoction. But the obvious question is, how in a flora of 80,000 or more species of vascular plants did the indigenous people learn to combine these in such a way to create a kind of biochemical version of the whole being greater than the sum of the parts? And again, the scientific explanation was trial and error, which really doesn't make sense. And then Schultes learned, for example, from the Siona sequoia in 1941 that, you know, the plants teach us. Well, what does that mean? Well, he identified among the Siona sequoia something like 17 varieties of the woody liana, all of which were referable to his Harvard-trained taxonomic eye as being the same species. And yet he noted that the indigenous people distinguished them consistently, sometimes at great distances in the forest. And when he asked them the nature of their systematics, they said that you took each one on the night of a full moon and it sang to you in a different key. Well, that's just another point of taxonomic delineation as far as Schultes was concerned, but it spoke about a different level of knowledge. And that same thing could be said about curare, the arrow poisons. Remember that curare, although we now know, and by the way, Schultes was sent to the Amazon to find the botanical source of curare, so he's paying a lot of attention to curare in the early months. We know that curare could be made from as many as 90 different species of plants throughout the Amazon basin, but the critical and consistent component is that D-tubocurare, the muscle relaxant, which causes the prey to collapse from the canopy of the forest, is only effective if it gets into the bloodstream. You or I could drink curare and nothing would happen to us. So again, you can see that the elaboration of these preparations was much more sophisticated than this sort of silly euphemism trial and error represents. And what Schultes was intuiting was something quite obvious that we only now understand. You know, remember, he's coming out of the 19th century in mindset. You know, he's born in 1916, but very much inspired by Richard Spruce and Wallace and Bates and Darwin. And at that time, anthropology was equally inspired by Darwin. And if species evolve, societies evolve. So Morgan and other armchair anthropologists in Britain in particular, Tyler, came up with this sort of idea of evolutionary anthropology, where we somehow went from the savage to the barbarian to the civilized to the Strand of London, that European society sat at the apex of the pyramid that went down to the so-called primitives of the world, that the measure of a culture exclusively was its technological dexterity. Mm-hmm. And so Schultes, you know, Schultes was influenced in a sense by that, but he was seeing something else going on. And now, of course, we realize that whole hierarchy of development was nonsense, that we know from modern genetics that every society is cut from the same genetic cloth. The genetic endowment of humanity is a continuum. All human populations share the same raw intellectual potential and genius. All of us are descendants from the handful of peoples who walked out of Africa 65,000 years ago. And so the critical thing is that if we share the same genius, how we expend that genius or develop that genius is a matter of choice and cultural orientation. we may celebrate technological wizardry, the Aboriginal people of Australia invest that same genius in the complex task of unraveling the mystic threads of memory inherent in a myth, or their devotional philosophy of the dream time, right? And so what Schultes was really seeing and writing about at a very early stage is that these individuals are not primitive in the slight, that the word primitive has no meaning whatsoever, that their knowledge of plants is equal to that of mine and far better than mine, trained as I was at the highest levels of science in North America, with 3 degrees from Harvard, he might have added. And he was recognizing, without being able to conceptualize what he was seeing really, that what he was really seeing were human beings taking all the genius that allowed us to put a man on the moon and applying it to a problem that they faced, which was an understanding of their botanical realm in a forest upon which their lives depended. So this is really what made Schultes such a pioneer. He was revealing things that he didn't fully understand himself. And yet he was so open to that world that he sowed these seeds that another generation could take to fruition.
Mm-hmm. And the important aspect of his, going back to what you were mentioning, his taking seriously the taxonomy and categorization of the people that he worked with, and not just coming with his preconceptions of what taxonomy looks like, what botanical names should be like, but taking seriously those of his collaborators in different parts of
I mean, it's like Tim Plowman. A lot of people are intimidated by Latin names, and they're just tools that allow us to put labels on plants, because otherwise, the realm of botany is too vast. And Tim always said, when you say the Latin names, you're just reciting the names of our gods. But folk classifications are of equal significance. In fact, one of the reasons, to be honest with you, and you first asked me about kind of a career trajectory. I've never, and I always encourage young people to never think about a vocation as some kind of coat you put on for the rest of your life. A vocation is just a lens through which you experience the world, and only for a time. For 6 years, actually 8 years, I was utterly focused on botany, and largely the flora and the ethnobotany of both Andean and Amazonian South America. But after a while, and I was, of course, originally trained in anthropology. My first degree was in anthropology. I realized that I was really more interested in the ethno side of things. And, I collected with other colleagues or by myself over 6,000 numbers, which, that adds up to about 30,000 botanical specimens. So I was a serious field botanist. But after a while, I realized I was not a taxonomist, because I did not have the fidelity to our Western classification system, even as people like my friend Tim did, who were showing, even though genetic techniques had yet to be developed, they were with their incredible precision of vision and interpretation. They were actually, with taxonomy, identifying evolutionary relationships that were true in terms of phylogeny. But at the same time, for me as an anthropologist, there was a sort of an arbitrary imposition of the Western classification on the natural world that, at the end of the day, I didn't find to be that useful. So for me, the great departure was when the opportunity came to go to Haiti and to use the lens of ethnobotany or ethnobiology in seeking the poison that reputedly used to make a zombie. No drug can make a social phenomena, but that pursuit opened up ethnographic and historical and cultural and spiritual windows wide open to the mystic that I was able to walk through. And so that project represented a true turning point in my career, intellectually and practically, because I ended up writing my first book, and that's what allowed me to go on and have a career as an independent scholar. And again, the reason I did that was really coming from a place of activism. I just really felt that the issues around the issues of biological and cultural diversity were so serious that they should not be sequestered in the ivory tower of the academic world. And since the 1970s, the academic world has become ever more insular every year, with scientists always encouraged to know more and more about less and less. And I always felt that my role, and I wasn't aware of it, but in retrospect, my role was not that of a scientist or a scholar alone, but as a storyteller, who uses various medium and draws on the scholarly training that I have, to do. I mean, every one of my books is the equivalent of a PhD in terms of research, but my mission is to tell stories that will shift hopefully the dial of history in some small way. And that's where I've always felt the public sphere is not only the place I wanted to be, it was the only place morally and ethically I could be.
Mm-hmm. And that actually leads really well into my next question. How can researchers who don't have a connection, you've spoken a bit about your years of field work, of having connection with communities through, in your field collections. How can researchers who don't have a connection to such communities forge these kinds of collaborations, or in other ways conduct due diligence to ensure that their own work as Western trained scientists or practitioners helps to amplify awareness and support of communities from which plant knowledge or other knowledge and practices originate?
Well, talk to people. I mean, there's no secret. I mean, people have always, young people in particular, have sort of often said to me, how, in so many words, how do I get to have a life like you had? And I said, I just say, start walking. In other words, a young person, a young scholar your age, Olivia, could look at someone my age and say, oh my gosh, that man or woman's done all this stuff. Well, of course I've done more stuff than you. I'm 66 years old, for Christ's sake. I mean, we forget that creativity is the consequence of action, not its motivation. Do what needs to be done and then ask whether it was possible or permissible. In the same way that pessimism is an indulgence, despair is an insult to the imagination, orthodoxy, the enemy of invention. People say, well, how do I, so many young people come to me these days and say, what program can I sign on to go and become a botanist like you did? Well, it's sort of an amazing indulgence. Like, why should the world exist to give you programs? Why should the Waorani or the Lowland Quechua or the Shuar have gap year programs for you? No, that's not how it works. You want to study these plants in situ with shaman. Go and visit the village. Talk to the elders. Be humble. Bring more than you give, bring more and give more than you take. Form collaborations that aren't based on ideological, constructs that the forms developed by ethics communities at universities. I mean, they're nonsense. Go and form human relationships. People ask me, how do you establish relationships with Indigenous people? Well, it's such an insulting question. I can't stand even the word Indigenous. I mean, what the hell does it mean? It's general to the point of inutility. Who isn't indigenous to this planet? What does that mean? When I want to, the way that I establish and have always established relationships is not by giving some person a form, a consent form that they sign in some moment of intimidation. It's to walk into the village and start splitting wood, to walk into an Athabascan community and hunt a moose. It's to do what I would expect anyone to do if they turned up at my house for Thanksgiving. It's not about bravado. It's about empathy and love. It's about good manners. It's about self-deprecating humor. It's about sleeping where you're asked to sleep and eating what you're asked to eat, and forging a human relationship before you get around to any kind of academic study. It's not rocket science, and it can't be legislated by politically correct boards at universities, as they, most of the people administering these things have never spent time in the field anyway. It's all about human interaction and this conceit that Indigenous people are delicate and frail and have to be protected from us by ethics committees and so on at universities is so unbelievably patronizing and insulting. I mean, I was once, I've been with many communities, and believe me, I was once in a community in Northwest Amazon living with, I won't mention the group, on a river called the Rio Ampiaco. And a cluster of foreigners arrived who had not been invited. And I was around in the in the Maloca with the men's circle, and I just heard them begin to talk about these mystical beings of the forest who killed outsiders, and those people were gone by the morning. I've known the belly of communities in Canada where vengeance is blood and has to be so. I mean, in other words, Indigenous people, quote unquote, are perfectly capable of looking after themselves and making their own decisions about who they want to engage in whatever activity that person proposes. We have this horrible idea, it's so patronizing, that these Indigenous peoples are quaint and colorful, but destined to fade away as if failed attempts at being modern, failed attempts at keeping up. That only masks the horrible reality that in every case, these are dynamic living peoples, not drifting away from history, but being driven out of history by identifiable forces. And whether those forces are egregious industrial developments or the ideological forces that range from the ubiquitous cult of modernity to the hideous Marxist madness of Beijing. These societies, if given a chance, can have and take, as is their due, their proper place at the Council of Human Wisdom. Every culture's got something to say. Each deserves to be heard. And so, I don't think we need to pander to Indigenous people as if they're weak. They're no more weak than we would be faced with a juggernaut of oppression, political, military, or industrial.
Mm-hmm. Great. So again, that also relates to one of my a couple of my next questions. One is about anthropologists being historically considered somewhat of cultural brokers, often between the state and various ethnic groups. So in the context of psychedelic science and medicine, what role do you see anthropologists having in integrating sociocultural insights without reproducing these colonial logics and that exoticize indigeneity and perpetuate extractionist knowledge gathering?
Well, I think that where anthropology can perhaps be, first of all, everything you just said there elevates the anthropologist to some kind of iconic figure of light and darkness that I don't really embrace. To me, anthropologists are just travelers with a particular point of view. The fact that because you call yourself an anthropologist, you have some a greater right to be in a place, or your interpretation of that place is somehow a priori more profound than that of a sensitive traveler. I just don't buy that. I don't think of myself when I travel ever as an anthropologist. I'm a storyteller. And in that sense, I believe that as a human being, I have a right to tell any story. And the people who will give me license to tell that story are the people with whom I'm living. And if they don't want me to tell that story, that will be abundantly clear to me. And not only will it be clear to me in explicit things they say, but also in how they operate. If people don't want you to explore a theme, they just won't say anything. I mean, in Inuit life, for example, I mean, the whole role of the shaman was to be in the background, to, the less said, the better. And so, I don't buy any of these tropes about anthropology always. I mean, I don't know why anthropology uses the language you just used, frankly. I think it's completely unhelpful. And it's just academic jargon that really has no meaning in the real world, in my opinion. Where we can be useful is as human beings, sharing our insights, and the validity of those insights will be the measure of their acceptance. Something, for example, ayahuasca around Iquitos. It's worth pointing out that what's actually going on there. I mean, the purpose, the utility of the anthropological lens is it allows you to look beneath this, encourages you as a human being to look beneath the surface of things. So, what do we see in Iquitos? We see indigenous people responding to an economic opportunity. We see people, visitors enchanted by the allure of the Shipibo, even though the Shipibo never lived around Iquitos. We see the people adopting the identity of being Shipibo to service an economic opportunity, which is young Americans and Europeans coming to the forest to experiment with this substance they've heard so much about, ayahuasca. But the anthropological lens can help people understand that the personal pursuit of wellness, the personal pursuit of enlightenment, if you will, or higher awareness, is not particularly consistent with the way that these sacraments were used in traditional communities in the Northwest Amazon. I mean, the use of ayahuasca, certainly amongst the Barasana and the Macuna and the Tanimucos and the Tucanos, is very much a collective experience whereby the community, in ritual, embarks on a collective journey to the divine. Where ayahuasca is used as a vehicle to not become a symbol of the ancestors, in the case of the Barasana, but to become an ancestor and to journey to the sacred sites, all of which is a journey conceived to reaffirm the central intuition of the people, which is that plants and animals are just people in another dimension of reality, and that human beings are essential to the maintenance of the energetic flows of the world, that human beings aren't the problem, we're the solution. And what we should be seeing in that as Westerners is a critical thing, which is much more important than any of that anthropological, politically correct jargon, is that cultural myopia has been the curse of humanity. The idea that my world is a real world, you're a failed attempt at being me. When Herodotus came back from Persia 500 years before Christ and had the audacity to say something interesting was going on over there in the Euphrates, Plato wanted him banned from Athens for the audacity of saying that someone beside the Greeks could have something to teach us. And we can't afford that cultural myopia anymore in the world. And that myopia, which we experience ourselves, of course, leads us to think that this modern world of ours is the norm, simply because it's powerful and it's ubiquitous. But the triumph of secular materialism may be the conceit of modernity, but it doesn't suggest for a moment that it's the norm. It's the anomaly. We in the West, again, products of our own history and culture, as we try to liberate ourselves from the tyranny of absolute faith, in the Enlightenment, we threw out all notions of myth, magic, mysticism, and metaphor, de-animated the world until Descartes said that all exists is mind and matter. Science, as Saul Bellows said, made a house cleaning of belief. The idea that a mountain could be a deity was ridiculed. And the human being began to be seen as a one player in a stage set upon which everything else was just a prop to support the human drama. A mountain was a pile of inert rock ready to be mined. A forest was cellulose and board feet. But most societies don't have that kind of extractive paradigm or metaphor. On the contrary, they view their relationship with the natural world based on reciprocity, the simple idea, which is elaborated in any number of ritualistic ways and mythical ways, that the earth owes its bounty to humans, but humans owe their fidelity to the earth. Now, that simple equation has dominated the interaction between human societies and the natural world in the vast majority of cultures. And it has profoundly different consequences. If you're raised to believe that a mountain's a pile of rock, you're going to have a different relationship than if you believe it's an Apu deity that directs your destiny, in the case of the mountains of the Andes. Or if you're raised to believe that a forest is board feet, you'll be different than the Kwakwaka'wakw, who believe that this is the domain of Hukuk and the crooked beak of heaven and the cannibal spirits. Again, it's not who's right and who's wrong. It's how the belief system has a consequence in terms of the ecological footprint of the society. And that's why, when I wrote a book once called The Wayfinders, where an editor put on a snappy subtitle, which I never liked, Why Ancient Wisdom Matters in the Modern World. I hated that subtitle because it implied that these societies were vestigial, which they most certainly are not. But it did force me to answer that question. And I did so in 2 words: climate change. Not to suggest that we go back to a pre-industrial past or that any society be kept from the genius of modernity, but rather the fact that viewed through the anthropological lens, the very existence of these alternate ways of thinking, of being, puts a lie to those of us in our own intellectual tradition who say that we cannot change, as we all know we must change, the fundamental way in which we occupy this planet. That's the message of the elder brothers, telling us to stop doing what we're doing, and so in that sense, the voice of these indigenous people, it remains strong, and it's there to remind us of other possibilities for life, and not a moment too soon.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, thank you. We have about 3 minutes left, but I just want to make the announcement now that there will be a after session Q&A. I believe the organizer will put the link in the chat box, but we do have 3 minutes. So I will just pose this last question, which is admittedly a bit of a big one to end with. Your writing and teaching emphasizes political action and activism, particularly with concerns for the environment and Indigenous rights. And you've recently given some talks, and this April wrote a piece for the Rolling Stone on the dangers of US exceptionalism, surveillance capitalism, and the importance of political accountability. So the tech industry in Silicon Valley in particular, which is where I'm speaking to you from, are deeply interwoven into the history and the future of psychedelic science and medicine. So again, this question is rather complex, but how can scholars, activists, scientists, and practitioners hold businesses and politicians accountable at these earlier stages of what is undoubtedly becoming a booming psychedelic industry?
Well, I mean, stepping back to think for a moment about psychedelics, I think it's, I earlier said, Olivia, we talked about women going from the kitchen to the boardroom and people of color and gay people into new lives. I find it fascinating that when we reflect on that sea change of culture, which is one of the reasons that I think there's such a schism in the United States, because don't forget that those incredibly dramatic changes that people like you and I see as being progressive, certainly they're not going to be put back into the bottle, also coincided with a time when globalization violated the American dream, the contract of reciprocity that grew out of World War II, the truce between labor and capital that allowed a working man with limited education to have a family, to support a family, to own a house, to own a car, send his kids to good schools. And over 2 generations, that promise was betrayed as working men and women saw globalization to be nothing more than a fluff piece, descriptive term for for capital on the prowl in pursuit of ever cheaper sources of labor. And so I think some people in that Trump cohort are individuals who got really burned by that, who feel that the world is no longer just, that the promise of the American dream has been betrayed, that they found themselves generations of men who took pride in building tanks and Liberty ships and automobiles, suddenly expected to either reconfigure their lives with technologies they don't understand and don't really care about, or in fact shelving groceries at Walmart. And that accounts for some of the terminal decadence of the society, the fact that the country consumes 2/3 of the world's antipsychotic, antidepressant drugs, that the highest cause of mortality for Americans under the age of 50 is opioid overdose and addiction. There's been the society that in the wake of World War II, made that promise based on the affluence that it had in a decade where marginal tax rates were 91%, where a CEO had wages that were 20 times perhaps that of a salaried employee, but not 400 times as they are today. When maybe rich people didn't pay 90%, but that was a symbol that everybody owed something. Today, the top 3 people own more wealth than the lower 160 million. The top 1% have $30 trillion of assets, the lower half of the population has more debt than assets. That fairness is broken down. And I think that there's a kind of conflation of the transformation of women and Black people and gay people with a loss of factory jobs, and it all happened at the same time, and it's all a bloody disaster, and I want no part of it. And until that fairness is addressed in American economic system, until there's economic justice as much as racial and social justice, I don't see the schism or the chasm in American society being bridged. All of that said, when we do look back on this sea change, which I think most of us would say has been positive, certainly if you're a woman, person of color, or if you're gay, 30, 40, when I was a kid, just getting people to stop throwing garbage out of a car window was an environmental victory. No one spoke of Gaia or biodiversity or biosphere. Now those terms are part of the language of school children. But curiously, when we look back at the ingredients in the recipe of social change, isn't it curious that the one ingredient consistently expunged from the record is that millions of us lay prostrate before the gates of awe, having taken some sacred medicine, some entheogen, some hallucinogen. And I always maintain that I wouldn't write the way I write. I wouldn't think the way I think. I wouldn't treat women the way I treat women. I wouldn't have understood, coming from the background that I grew up in the bush in British Columbia, homosexuality as I do. I certainly wouldn't relate to the natural world as I do had I not taken psychedelics. And they changed my life. When our parents back in the day would say in horror, don't take these things, you'll never come back the same. What they didn't understand is that that was precisely the point, and that we wanted to escape a world that we saw as problematic. We all shared Baudelaire's malady, horror of home. I think it's very difficult for young people your age, Olivia, particularly young women, and I've got two daughters in their early 30s, for them to understand what their grandmother went through. My mom, had she been alive today, would be running General Motors, and yet her life was crushed by the lack of opportunities available to her. So there was a world in which gay people were committing suicide. The slightest hint that you were homosexual would ruin your career, be it in the State Department, the United Nations, or in a major corporation. The treatment of people of color with such extraordinary contempt. It's hard to remember that world. And I wanted no part of it, not to mention Vietnam and any number of other things going on. And so I found in psychedelics an opening to another world. And I think that what's exciting about the Renaissance is that we're now able to recognize just how productive and helpful the psychedelic vision can be therapeutically, but also just in terms of personal growth. And of course, there are two ways you can react to this. You can follow the route of Ram Dass, Richard Albert, who famously said, get the message and hang up, or you can follow the route of the wonderful Timothy Leary, who found, as John Lennon did for a while, that the ongoing use of these substances was a useful thing to do. I'm not casting judgment. I'm in the Ram Dass camp, but I firmly believe that these substances can be transformative. And so, the use of them by executives at Silicon Valley, I herald. But on the other hand, every drug every psychedelic at least, has a completely neutral potential for good and evil. It all depends on the set and setting and the aspirations of the participant in the ceremony or in the moment. So, in and of themselves, psychedelics won't take us anywhere, mm-hmm. But combined to a new vision of life itself, vis-a-vis the natural world, vis-a-vis each other, vis-a-vis justice in general, then the psychedelics can really take us into new worlds of wonder.
Thank you. We've gone about 5 minutes over time, but thank you so much for sharing. Joost, I don't know if you wanted to make an announcement now. You've tuned in.
I actually just wanted to use my privilege to allow you one more question, because this has been such an interesting talk. This is our big break. We have about an hour or so.
Oh, wonderful.
Maybe you can take one question from the audience before we wrap this up.
Sure. Let me look. Oh, at the Q&A?
Yeah, sorry. So there's questions in the Q&A and in the chat as well.
Let's see, which is a good one. So there's one question here. I'll give you the choice, Wade. What are your thoughts on increasing commodification and medicalization of psychedelic experience? And then there's one here about, which you already spoke about quite a bit on, going from glorifying anthropology for apparently being behind so many aspects of social progress in the last century to dismiss the role or responsibility of the anthropologist to avoid the colonial dynamics and extractivism that has characterized scientific engagement with indigenous communities. So I think you spoke a bit about that. Maybe we should talk about the commodification, medicalization of psychedelic experience.
I think the real challenge before us is that, look, you know, through history, psychedelics have been subversive. You know, if you think of the, you know, the origin of religion, you know, every culture's religious beliefs fundamentally revolve around its interpretation of what happens to us after death. You know, every religion is wrestling with eternity and trying to come out on top. And in the early days of human awareness, if you go back, for example, I've spent a great deal of time in the upper Paleolithic caves of Lascaux and Pechmer and Chauvet in southwestern France and adjacent parts of Spain. You know, what I found so interesting about that experience was that the articulation of art reflects an incredible level of sophistication. And yet the aesthetic itself is relatively consistent from Chauvet in 32,000 years ago to Lascaux 15 to 17,000 years ago. And what that means is that for a chronological distance greater than 5 times greater than what separates us from the building of the Great Pyramids at Giza in Egypt, human beings were expressing themselves with essentially the same aesthetic, which is kind of amazing. And it's not hunting magic, it's something else. And at one point we were clearly of an animal nature by definition. At some point we weren't. And whether it was the development of language, the increase in the size of the human brain, or some other evolutionary catalyst, we became who we are, conscious beings. And that was sort of the birth of our discontent. And ever since then, all of human existence has come down to how we answer 2 questions, how and why. And I think of that art form as almost postcards of nostalgia, as if we were trying to reach back across a chasm that was unbridgeable, inexorable, to a time when we were one with the animal world, right? And I think of it as postcards of nostalgia, and ours was a very long farewell, 25,000 years. But the early human societies, you know, were hunting and gathering societies, and the religious impulse was derived in good measure from the fact that as hunters, they had to kill the thing they loved most, the animals upon which they depended. And death in that sense became the first teacher, the edge beyond which life as they knew it ended and wonder began. And if you look at rituals in hunting societies, for example, whether it's the way that the Aboriginal people in Australia, the extraordinary precision and the process by which the cadaver of a killed kangaroo has to be treated, or the fact that among the Inuit, you know, a seal, if a seal is killed, if you don't drip fresh water into its mouth, you will never have another kill. And in fact, the Inuit believe that the animals have to be treated with such respect. But at the same time, they really believe that if the animals are not hunted, they will die off. So there's this incredible relationship. And shamanism grew out of that early years. And the role of the shaman was to catalyze the individual's wild genius. And that's why, incidentally, you have this strange anomalous distribution of hallucinogens. Of the 120 known naturally occurring hallucinogenic agents, 90% or more from the Americas, not because the forests of equatorial West Africa or Southeast Asia were depauperate, but because people there had other avenues to the divine, spirit possession in West Africa in particular. But the use of these entheogens is concentrated in good measure, with some noted exceptions like Iboga in Nigeria and so on, in the Americas, largely in societies that were based on shamanism in terms of the religious aspiration. Now, as Joseph Campbell says, the priest comes along and he's got a very different role. He's not interested in the release of anybody's genius. He's interested in socializing the collective into a congregation that can be influenced and dominated by the ideology of the state. Totally different scene. And so in that sense, these hallucinogens are as subversive as they have been said to be. I mean, when my mother said, "Don't take these things, you'll never come back the same," she was quite right. And so, you know, it is interesting to see how the world came down on those early pioneers. You know, it's interesting that I was very fortunate because of my association with Richard Evans Schultes to know not only his great proteges, Andrew Weil and Tim Plowman, who were like big brothers to me, but because of his friendships, I got to meet Albert Hoffman and Gordon Wasson and Sacha Shulgin and Weston LeBar and all these early pioneers who were taking these substances without any set and setting, any context of expectation, right? They were just solitary scholars from all walks of life, from bankers to chemists to botanists to anthropologists, who were curious about these plants. And then the state came down like a juggernaut. Don't forget that the war on drugs was created by Nixon. He had no interest or concern about drug use. What he wanted to do, as Ehrlichman's memoirs make clear, was to create a wedge issue that would generate a barrier around what he called the silent majority for electoral purposes in 1968. And he knew that the majority of Americans, who, by the way, in the 1960s looked more like Tricia Nixon than Joni Mitchell, I can assure you, they wanted, the things they were afraid of were Black social movements and the burning of the American cities and the hippies and drugs. And so the war on drugs began as a political purpose with no interest whatsoever. And that's why to this day it's so hypocritical. There's not one person involved in the war on drugs who has any interest, inclination in winning that war on drugs. They'd be out of work. It's just been this $1 trillion charade that has caused nothing but agony in the world. But my point is, don't underestimate the capabilities of the state to come back down on this movement. Don't forget, Timothy Leary, who's been reduced to ridicule, was a brilliant social psychologist. He experienced a professional crisis of confidence when a study came out that said that no matter what the psychiatric affliction and no matter what the intervention, a third of patients got better, a third stayed the same, and a third got worse. At that moment in his career, he discovers psychedelics. And here's maybe the opening, an opening that now clinically we know to be real and true and potent. And the state came down on him so hard that that man, if you can imagine, few of your generation realize that he did serious time in a federal penitentiary of San Quentin in solitary confinement for months for the single charge of being in possession of one joint of marijuana. So the state has a capability of reversing all of this openness, and so that's why I think those working, like, you know, so many fantastic people from Paul Stamets and Dennis McKenna and Rick Doblins and I mean so many wonderful men and women in this emerging field of psychedelic therapy have to be and are being extremely careful. Shrouding their practices in the language of science, methodologies carefully vetted, and so on, because the state could shut this down so very quickly. Because, you know, at the end of the day, these substances are both illuminating but potentially subversive.
Thank you very much. I'll give the last word to you, Olivia, before I think both of you. This is what happens when I give you room for one more question.
Well, I think it was worth it. I hope I think I speak on behalf of all of the audience that it's just so wonderful to hear you talk on such a broad range of facets of this, of psychedelic use, of plant medicine, indigeneity, politics. It's all really interwoven. And, as you said before, we tend to focus, especially in these conferences, on topics that get more and more particular, more and more specific, and we lose the broad perspective. So it's very wonderful to get the opportunity for an entire hour to hear you really bring in all of these different facets of one giant holistic issue that we're, I think, collectively very concerned about, which is what brings us together here.
Well,
And
thank you, Olivia. And having said all that I said, we never got around to your research. And I want everybody in the audience to know that Olivia is doing incredible research in Peru around Tarapoto over the whole use of ayahuasca. And it's so important because that's sort of the interface at the moment, and the challenges of ayahuasca tourism and the potential to both empower local communities and to corrupt local communities is there. So I really herald your research, and I certainly want to learn more about it, Olivia.
Well, I can jump in there, because the final panel discussion on Sunday, the closing panel discussion on Sunday, will feature Olivia and her research, which will be dedicated to globalizing ayahuasca.
And
Good.
it's not terribly early for us on the Pacific Coast.
Oh, nice. When is it, Olivia? Could you guys send me a link to it, maybe? Would that be okay?
Will do.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Olivia, for facilitating this, as you said, incredibly wide-ranging conversation. That was very powerful. I'm so glad we were able to have you after all. Wade,
thank you so much. I mean, wow, you've done a great job putting this conference together in the middle of COVID. I mean, it's just such a crazy thing that's happened. The world's kind of gone to the car wash, but you still sort of pulled it off. So I really appreciate a chance to be with you all.
I'm honored, and I'm very pleased that we were able to have you after all. There is a link to the after talk. The after talk is the kind of equivalent of you walking off stage, people mobbing you. So it's a small room that features that will hold roughly 30 people. We'll send you the link to Olivia's panel tomorrow. Also, I wanted to note, as I was sitting downstairs watching your lecture, I wanted to introduce the indigenous quote unquote projects, but then I was afraid of using the word indigenous because of your very eloquent.
I'll tell you, the thing about indigenous is like, I just, for example, like if I told you a story, let me tell you a story about my own people. In the time of my great grandfather's father, a disease arrived on our island from another continent that destroyed all of our food. And our colonial oppressor refused to divert ample alternative sources of food, so that 1 million of my people died. And of those who survived, fully a third had to flee the island in their rags, desperate for a new life. The oppressor then came in, and with the dominant religious ideology that was not ours, took away our children and forced them into schools where they had to learn the language of the oppressor. And as a result, today, only 0.014% of my people speak their mother tongue. Now, I'm just making this as a polemical point, but my people are the Irish. And it's very important to remember that no culture is good versus bad. No culture has a monopoly on grief or glory. That we're all, and I realize that one wants to be careful saying we're all in this together, because you suddenly get into the Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter controversy. But that aside, the question isn't the traditional versus the modern. It's about the rights of free people to choose the components of their lives. It's not about whether we go back to a pre-industrial past or any society be kept from the genius of modernity. It's to ask the question is, what kind of world do we all want to live in? And how do we find a way to live in a peaceful world of pluralism and multiculturalism where every voice is respected? It's as simple as that. And that's, Olivia, one of the reasons why I object to the politics of grievance that dominates anthropology schools today. To my opinion, it completely misses the point. The point is not who was hurt more, but what world are we going to create?
Thank you very much. I would really love to continue the conversation. You may have heard in the background that some violin sounds, meaning that this is our I guess for us this is our dinner break. For some others it will be our maybe our breakfast, maybe lunchtime. In any case, we'll have a violin concerto which is taking place in the room right next to me. Which I'll, as soon as I wrap this up, I'll go there, introduce the violinist. And just, I did want to point you to the sponsor page, where we have a link where you can donate to the project of the speakers, the Ashinanka, the Hunikui, and the Mazatec speakers, which will be featured in the conference. One of the speakers, Juan Flores, from the Ashinanka, actually came down with COVID, which is why he's unable to make it himself, him and his wife both. I'm not sure how they're doing currently. But all of them have been impacted by the pandemic. So we've included links to donate to the projects, and the money that we had reserved to bring them over to Amsterdam we'll now use to donate directly to their communities. So once again, thank you very much. Sorry, David. Sorry, Wade. I'll give you the final word, or maybe.
No, I say that I have a wonderful Brazilian graduate student who works for the Ashinanka. And she's just spent some time in their communities. I mean, all through the Amazon and all through the Andes, you know, it's just this horrible echo of the way that pestilence at the time of the conquest, you know, we say it killed, you know, it decimated the people, but that's a misuse of Latin. Decimate means to kill 1 in 10. It was 90% of the peoples died of these exogenous diseases. And in fact, people like the Haida in mythology or folklore described smallpox as a blue cloud that came up the coast of miasma of death. Well, we know that scientifically it was not a blue cloud, but that image perfectly distills what these diseases meant to people who had never been exposed to them. So to think that in the year 2021, or whatever, what year are we? 2020? Yeah, 2020, I guess. These kind of diseases are still ravaging indigenous people is so haunting that I find it is agonizing.
Yeah, I fully agree. Yeah, it's not a positive note to end on, but we do need to wrap up. Also, as a final reference to our own program, some of the issues that you touched upon will be addressed in other panel discussions, including one today on the cultural, societal, political aspects of mainstreaming psychedelics. We are, after all, an interdisciplinary conference. We'll have another panel discussion on the impact and consequences of the medicalization of psychedelics tomorrow as well. So thank you very much, Olivia, for hosting this beautiful, powerful conversation. There's a lot to digest here for me and for my colleagues downstairs. Thank you very much. The link to the after talk is in the description in Huva, and I hope to see you again. Thank you.
Thanks, you.